I've got stuff I've got to do today. I've got, like housework to complete. I've got a blog post about my favorite games of the year to finish before the year is out in just under 11 hours. And basically, what I'm saying is I shouldn't be sitting in front of my monitor ranting about some Spider Man comics, but damn it, I've got to get this out of me. The Clone Saga, you've seen it in the title, you know that's what I'm talking about. And if you've read comics, you know where this is going. But man, I was warned about the Clone Saga, but I thought, nah, it's important to know. I'm doing a thing where I'm reading through all the recommended Spider-Man comics, although I now doubt my reading order guide because it tried to get me to skip the what's called the final chapter, the end of the Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1 run, but that's besides the point, although it does kind of tie into this video as well. What my reading order, and I'm using comicbookreadingorders.com, what that guide said about the Clone Saga is, you should probably read it. It's not very good, but you should probably read it. And I didn't know what it was talking about at first. For those of you unfamiliar with Clone Saga, I will try to sum up events as I'm going through. So, at the beginning, we are introduced to Ben Reilly, who is ostensibly Spider-Man's clone, because in a story way back in either the 60s or the 70s, I no longer remember, shortly after the death of Gwen Stacy, there was a storyline involving a mysterious villain named the Jackal, and he cloned Peter Parker, and it was like this kind of like, the Spider-Man pointing meme? It was a little bit of that. There were two Spider-Men, and they were fighting each other, and then they realized they had to work together to stop a bomb going off, and then one of them got caught in a blast and died, and the other one escaped. And it was like, oh, okay, well, obviously the real Peter Parker escaped, but they left it open-ended. They were like, but wait, what if I am the clone? And so he goes and gets some test results done from, I believe, the Lizard, or the Dr. Kurt Connors, that guy, who's good at this point in time. He flip-flops. And he gets the test results and he decides not to open them, because, that would be... He knows he's the real Peter Parker, and the issue is never brought up again, and I think it was never meant to be, right? And it's meant to be like, he could be the clone, haha, technically, thanks to a story way back in the 70s, he could be the clone, that's kind of how it should have been left. But fast forward a couple of decades, and some writer has a bright idea. Hey, what if the other clone wasn't dead? And I think there was a thing about him tossing the body into a smokestack, except he wasn't going to, except maybe he did, I don't remember anymore. But that clone lived. And he turned out to be Ben Reilly. And here's where I really liked it. I really enjoy Ben Reilly as a character. The whole imposter syndrome thing he's got going on, the whole being exiled from his own life even though it's not his own life, that stuff is genuinely brilliant. Ben Reilly is legitimately a compelling character, and I know he's recently been brought back. I don't know in what form, if it's like flashback comics or if he's actually brought back into the main story timeline at the minute, but I'm excited to see his return. And there is in particular a really brilliant run of comics called The Lost Years, where it talks about Ben Reilly, realizing he's the clone and leaving New York City, and how he deals with that and how it changes him and the life he makes, and the person he finds in Salt Lake City, and all that. And it's brilliant. And there's even another clone of Peter Parker called Kane, and it's like a failed clone. I forget the sequence of events in which we learn who he is, but I'm pretty sure in The Lost Years we're told that he's another clone of Peter Parker. And throughout the Clone Saga, he's kind of this villain, but in this story he's not quite a villain yet. It's more of like his origin story of him kind of losing it. He's got like this degeneration thing going on, and he's in constant pain, and he hates Ben Reilly for some reason. And yeah, I don't hate Kane either. I think Kane, at least to begin with, was a pretty decent villain. Now, another thing to take into consideration is that there were a lot of Spider-Man comics running simultaneously at this point, and it gets a little bit muddled what the order's meant to be. I eventually did away with my third-party reading guide and just read the event guide in the Marvel Comics Unlimited app, which I would recommend using. It's pretty good, but I'm pretty sure you read The Lost Years before you're meant to. I think they do the thing where they give it to you in chronological order instead of the year it was actually released. So they're like, oh yeah, and we already know that at this point, we're trying to tell you, and this is where it starts to get a bit stupid, that, and spoilers because I'm going to tell you how it plays out, we're trying to tell you that Ben Reilly is actually the real one and Peter Parker is the clone, but neither of them know this yet. So they're living opposite lives than they should be. And that is a legitimately cool idea. I would say that if we're going by the reading order in the Marvel Comics Unlimited app, up until the Jackal gets reintroduced is good stuff, and I like it. And then the Jackal gets reintroduced, and it all goes to shit. Instead of this really cool dynamic of these three Peter Parkers, and who might be the clone and who might not be, and who's living a fake life and who's exiled themselves from everyone they love and is still trying to deal with it. That stuff's all cool, especially as you see Ben Reilly become Scarlet Spider as well. That's all really cool. But eventually the Jackal shows up, and suddenly, and this is where it gets so obviously retconny, suddenly the Miles Warren that you saw die in the original comic, that was a clone I made for the purpose of dying so that you would think I was dead. And this is going to become a running theme. It was a clone I made! And he tries to mess with their heads, coming off as just a very mustache twirly villain. Actually, Ben Reilly's the real one. Actually, Peter Parker's the real one. Actually, you're both clones. And like, I think it was literally all in one comic. He said all of those things and a few more besides. And I remember just being like, why? And then he brought out another Gwen Stacy clone, and we already knew there was one Gwen Stacy clone running around, and don't worry, because she pops up in the story later. And she marries Miles Warren, which I find kind of unlikely, but sure. A clone of Miles Warren, I should say. Because, of course, there's a clone of Miles Warren living with a clone of Gwen Stacy. I, Christian from the future post-rant, just sliding in to say, I completely forgot to even mention Spider-Side, who is another clone of Peter Parker that they were trying to pass off as the real one for a handful of comics. He goes a bit nuts because he thinks he's the real Peter Parker when he's not, and he can also get stretchy, which the original one couldn't do, but that doesn't stop him from thinking he's the real one. Never mind. Anyway, it just gets stupider from there. And then they try and do a whole bunch of comics where it's like they're still going about their general adventures with all of this uncertainty playing out in the background. And I do think some of that stuff is good, but it just gets dumber and dumber and more convoluted. And I haven't even got to the dumbest point yet. The Clone Saga apparently ends with Peter Parker having to accept the fact, because they've gone to Ben Reilly's lifelong friend, a scientist, to get themselves tested. Like, once and for all, let's put this behind us, let's see who is real and who is the clone. And they find out, undeniably, from the tests, that this is a real nail in the coffin, that Peter and Ben Reilly have helped themselves to do, because they both have intelligent scientific brains. It's not like they just asked the guy and he did it for them. Who's real? Who's a clone? Turns out Peter Parker's a clone, Ben Reilly's real. That's legitimately quite interesting, and they do stick with it for a while, and Peter Parker has to live with this idea of being a clone, and he has imposter syndrome going on now, and you know, you've got Mary Jane trying to tell him that she still loves him, and by the way, Mary Jane's pregnant at this point, and I actually didn't see what happened with that, but I assume it was depressing and not very well handled, because it was skipped by both the event reading guide and the third-party reading guide. But at the point I'm reading, she's not pregnant anymore. If it turns out the baby was a clone, I am actually going to strangle someone. Anyway, so that's where things lie. Peter Parker decides to give up on being Spider-Man, because it's just no good. And asks Ben Reilly to be Spider-Man instead. And I assume there's a long stint of comics where Ben Reilly's Spider-Man. I think my reading order mostly skipped that part, sadly. But it was. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that throughout all of this, Aunt May has suffered from a stroke and is dying. And there's a whole subplot at one point where Peter Parker has been poisoned and he's on the verge of death, and he's about to go and die, and he visits the spirit of Aunt May, and Aunt May tells him where to go to get to heaven, and he starts to go there, and then he gets saved by Dr. Octopus through some stupid convoluted string of events. And that's just one clue of many that this is the real Aunt May who's dying, right? It wouldn't be some kind of imposter, right? Right? Well, it's funny you should ask. Turns out, behind this entire Clone Saga, it was Norman Osborn all along. Remember the Green Goblin who died so long ago? Didn't die. Turns out he had regenerative powers. Who knew? And he orchestrated everything. Oh my god, I forgot to mention a scryer. For scryer. So throughout some of the sub-stories, throughout the Clone Saga, there are these two enigmatic, mysterious characters. There is Judas someone, I've forgotten his name already, but he was this professor dude who turned out to be this mystical figure who'd lived for centuries with very strong powers to, like, do illusions, and at one point he sends Peter Parker forward a day in time and all that. And then there's a scryer who's meant to be like his mysterious companion who's also got mysterious powers. And basically it turns out the professor dude, who is slightly bonkers and wants to figure out the true nature of evil, turns out he was just a dude who suffered a nervous breakdown which caused recessive mutant genes to give him powers, so he convinced himself he was this hundreds of years old dude, which is the biggest stink of retcon I think there is in this entire thing, apart from the Aunt May thing, which we're getting to. And then Scryer is pretty much all smoke and mirrors, except for one point when he actually gets powers, and I've already deleted that from my brain how that happens. But he is an agent of Norman Osborn's, because Norman Osborn is in Europe, and he has found a cult of scryers. That's right, there's more than just one, and he has become their leader. And so he uses this scryer to manipulate Miles Warren into doing a lot of the things that Miles Warren does, also known as the Jackal. But one of the things he gets the scryer to do is to go and blackmail Miles Warren's assistant, who turns out to be that professor dude that Ben Reilly is friends with, so that the professor dude would scramble the definitive results about who's real and who's a clone, because it would cause more suffering to the real Peter Parker if he believed he was a clone, and then found out that he wasn't. Are you getting a sense of how convoluted this is? So it was Norman Osborn all along, just fucking with Peter Parker. Ben Reilly really is the clone, Peter Parker really is the real one. And then there's the Aunt May thing. Do you know who Aunt May was? Do you know who Aunt May was? She was a paid actor. No, I'm not making this up. She was a paid actor who underwent surgery to look like a doppelganger of Aunt May, and she was so invested in her acting career that she died. Literally died to sell the fact that she was Aunt May. Or maybe, I think there was something in the Osborn Journal about she didn't realise she would die doing it, but she doesn't get poisoned or anything, so she just dies. And she's still, as she's dying, she's still pretending to be Aunt May. Because here's the thing. We're not idiots. We can tell that was meant to be the real Aunt May. This isn't something they planned from the start. It's very obviously not. There is even this thing called the Norman Osborn Journal, where it talks in detail about how he was behind everything with the clone stuff. And he mentions at one point, "Ooh, Aunt May has died. I can make use of that." So how would Osborn not know that the one he had hired to play as Aunt May and die, it's because he wrote the journal for Peter Parker to find. Obviously, because he was definitely questioning whether Aunt May was real. He wasn't. Norman Osborn had Aunt May the whole time, just sedated somewhere, and then he implanted a thing in her brain that, if removed and oxidized, would set off a bunch of bombs everywhere and kill a whole bunch of people. So Peter Parker had to decide, would he save his aunt or would he save people? So Peter Parker just took her to Reed Richards and said, "Hey, can you do it?" And Reed Richards said, "Yes, I'll do it." And then it was done, and then it was over. And you know what? At the end of all of it, Peter Parker is the original. Ben Reilly is the clone. Aunt May is alive and doesn't know that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Nothing has changed after all that, because they went through such lengths to retcon it all back to normal, presumably because everyone hated the changes that they had made. Like, they don't print the bad letters that they get sent in the readers' letters section, but it's pretty obvious because after this is all said and done and buried and no more clone stuff, there are multiple references, even within the next just year of comics, that are like, "Oh, you're not a clone, are you? Oh, we've had enough of that," you know? Like, even the writers are like, that was so dumb. And I am concerned, because I believe it's 2019, there is a run of Spider-Man comics called The Clone Conspiracy. And I'm just like, please don't. Please don't do it again. I have read 2 other versions of this clone story, and they are better versions. There is a limited series, which I've not read all of, but it's, I forget what it's called, but it's basically, what if the Spider-Man story had occurred in real time? So, like, Peter Parker's literally aging, and I think he's in 40s when the clone conspiracy thing happens. And, again, it was a long time ago that I read it, but I remember it being better than this. And Ultimate Spider-Man also has a clone conspiracy thing, but it's not super long and convoluted, and it's not a who's the real one thing. It's, hey, we've cloned you, and also changed the gender, and that's how Jessica Drew exists in the Ultimate Spider-Man universe, and I really like her. I don't think she's meant to be like this trans icon, because they wrote this in the 2000s, and I don't personally trust Brian Michael Bendis to have been that forward-thinking back then, or anyone really, but she definitely comes off that way, and I'm a huge fan of her character, and I wish they'd brought her over to the mainline universe. But I think the reason they probably went for the gender swap with the clone thing is so they couldn't get wrapped up in who's the real one. And I think what both of these clone stories take advantage of is the fact that they're not doing this on a week-to-week basis or a month-to-month basis, and then retconning it all back into place afterwards. They're recognizing what went wrong with the original story, with how convoluted it was and how people hated the changes, and they're actually making a complete story. In fact, that's why you should, if you are going to get into reading Spider-Man comics, please read Ultimate Spider-Man. I think it's better. I'm doing this for science, but there are some really good original Spider-Man comics, obviously, because otherwise why would anyone like the character? But yeah, that's the Clone Saga. I was warned, and I read it. And this is all in my brain now, and hopefully in a year or two it'll join some of the other comics back there that I don't remember much about, and I can go, hey, wasn't I really annoyed about the whole clone thing? And I can go back and listen to this video and go, oh boy, I was really annoyed about the whole clone thing. But now I'm in the early 2000s era of comics. I'm at volume 2, finally, of Amazing Spider-Man. And it looks like they really have fully put the whole clone thing behind them. As long as this stupid 2019 clone conspiracy thing doesn't upend everything again, I think we'll be okay. Thank you for listening. If you read the clone conspiracy and came here to hear someone's thoughts about it, what did you think about what I thought about it? Why not leave a comment? If you don't read comics, I don't know if I really gave you a good comprehensive idea of everything that happened in the Clone Saga, but hopefully I gave you a general overview of how dumb it was. So if you want to read it for yourself, Marvel Comics Unlimited is a great app that lets you waste your time with storylines like these. Other things you could do with your time is watch more of my videos. Subscribe. Oh, fuck me.